So one of the things that I've found over the years is that my memories of my early childhood, there's not very many of them. And it's sometimes fascinating to go back and just think through what memories do you have of your childhood? What things come to mind? And sometimes it's surprising which things stick with me. I can think of one particular story that shouldn't have stuck with me, but it did. I was probably in kindergarten at the time, maybe first grade. And I was coming to church here, and I wasn't regularly attending all of the time. That's part of my family's story. But at the time, I had gone to children's church, and one of the leaders had asked a question. It was like a Bible-based question. And somehow I knew the answer to it, which I almost never did at the time. And the reward for getting the question right was a little piece of candy. Now, the details are fuzzy. I couldn't tell you exactly what candy it was. So in my mind, I'm going to say it's Three Musketeers because that's like my favorite candy bar. So I'm going to say it was a fun-sized little thing of Three Musketeers just because, for me, that would have been a big deal. But whatever it was, in order to get me the candy, the leader had to throw it into the audience, right? So I'm looking at a bunch of empty chairs right now. It kind of looked a little bit like what I'm staring at. And so if I was 4 or 5 rows back, the leader from the stage took that piece of candy and threw it my direction. And being 5 years older, so I gave it a shot, but I didn't quite catch it. I think it was slightly underthrown, and so it scooted right underneath my chair. I decided it was easy enough to pick up, so I go down to reach for it and to grab it, and it's not there. Out of the corner of my eye, the kid behind me, who was, at the time and still is, one of my best friends, grabbed the candy, unwrapped it, and I turned around just in time to see him eat the thing whole. I was flabbergasted. Like, this little 5-year-old me, I had won this candy, and now I have no candy because my friend, he stole it from me. And so I turn around, I look at him, just like dumbfounded on my face. And the leader was still talking, so I didn't want to interrupt him, but all I could think of, just looking at him, is just, why? Why would you do that? And if you've ever talked to a little kid who just can't control their impulses, right, they know when they've done something they shouldn't have done. And so, like in this case, I'm sure my friend, he knew he shouldn't have eaten my candy. That's a no-brainer. But if you ask a little kid, why did you do this thing that you clearly knew you weren't supposed to do, they're never going to answer this way. Well, I was hungry. And because I was hungry, I couldn't control myself from going and picking up the candy. They know that's not a good enough answer. So what they'll say instead, and kids do this all the time, they just said, I don't know. I don't know why I did that thing. I don't know why I picked up your candy and ate it. I don't know why I tried to put the fork in the electrical outlet. I don't know why I'm touching hot stoves. That's just the way that kids are. Sometimes we do things, and the reason for it just seems inexplicable. I don't know. What is going on with that? Well, today we're going to look a little bit at the I don't know why I did that kind of situations. So if you have your Bibles, go ahead and turn to the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 26. That's where we're going to be for most of it, although we're going to have some work to do to get there. We're in a series that we're calling Crossroads. And we've been doing this series, actually we started it right before kind of all of this church at home stuff became a necessity. And so you might have forgotten already the first week that we did this. But in the first week we looked at, in Matthew, the last part of Matthew's gospel, we looked at the Pharisees, the teachers of the law, and the children, and the very different responses they had to Jesus. And last week, Dave talked us through Mary and her response to Jesus' message that he was going to die, and Judas. They were very different. And part of this was inspired by our Bible reading plan, right? So in our Bible reading plan, if you've been following with us, you actually just finished the Gospel of Matthew, which makes this, by the way, a perfect time to jump in. If you haven't been tracking with us, I encourage you to start now, because in just a couple days, we're going to jump into a brand new gospel. This is the perfect opportunity to jump in. Also, if you download that fancy app that Dave just told you about, and you select Bible reading as a in your notification center, you can get a daily update with the Bible reading attached. So we're going to start pumping those out as soon as we begin reading the Gospel of Mark. So if you haven't done it yet, if you're not using your phone to watch this right now, grab your phone, go ahead and get that app, because it's going to be really helpful for you if you're jumping into the Bible reading plan. But as we kind of looked at the end of Matthew's gospel, we wanted to see how these different players interacted with the message of Jesus. And so we're going to do that today, but it's going to be a little bit different, because we're actually just using one person, and it's this person battling himself. Today, we're going to look at Peter. If you read Matthew 26, usually if we preach out of Matthew 26, we put most of the focus on Jesus. We're going to do something a little bit different today. We're going to focus on the way that Peter interacted with Jesus during his final moments before he was handed over to be crucified. This is the same Peter who, in Matthew chapter 14, saw Jesus walking on water and had the faith in Jesus to say, I want to walk on water too. And Jesus let him. And so Peter, he gets out of the boat and he walks on water toward Jesus. I mean, this is a big thing. But the same Peter who had the faith to walk on water found the winds to be scary. I want to pull at Matthew chapter 14, verse 30. It says this, but when he, Peter, saw the wind, he was afraid and, beginning to sink, cried out, Lord, save me. Immediately Jesus reached out his hand and caught him. You of little faith, he said, why did you doubt? Now, in my mind, when Jesus asked the question, why did you doubt? Peter didn't have a good answer, so he probably said, I don't know. I mean, Jesus, he just gave him all of the ability to walk on water with him. This is an incredibly powerful moment, right? He sees Jesus, he's doing something he's never done before. He has this amazing experience. And yet, when the wind came, he doubted. Something inside of him triggered, and despite the incredible faith that he had shown before that moment, now he was beginning to doubt. There's something going on inside of Peter in this moment that I think actually goes inside most of us. And I'm going to use a little bit of Dallas Willard here because he has some terms for the kinds of things I want to talk about. So I'm just going to use Dallas Willard's terms for a few of these things. Dallas talks about two different kinds of will, and Peter has both of these in spades, right? The first is this idea of an impulsive will. And this is the will of my friend in the candy eating story, right? There wasn't really any thought. All it was this knowledge that I'm hungry, that eating this food is what I want to do, and so I'm going to do it. Forget the consequences. This is our impulsive will. This is when we act simply out of what we want to do in the moment. And it can be any kind of thing, right? We're hungry, so we eat. We're tired, so we sleep. And there's nothing wrong with those things. Actually, we need them to survive. But sometimes they can get the better of us too. I'm afraid. And because I'm afraid, I lash out at the people around me or I hoard things near me because of my fear. And those things begin to kind of take over the way that we respond in certain situations. Now, opposed to the impulsive will is a different kind, and that's the reflective will. The reflective will is the one that we're actually thinking about. It's the one that we're actually trying to choose. The reflective will is when we say, I might put aside my impulses for a moment for a greater purpose. For instance, if my friend had been considering his relationship with me, he might not have eaten the candy. But he wasn't acting out of his concern for me. He was acting out of his concern for his impulsiveness, his impulsive will. And so that's what happened. Reflective will can be good and it can be bad. All right, so the New York Times came out with a story a little while ago, a couple weeks ago, about someone who had bought a whole bunch of hand sanitizer during this crisis. But this person was not operating out of fear. This person bought all the hand sanitizer because he wanted to sell them at a significantly marked up price. All right? That wasn't fear. That was just kind of being mean. And while the rest of us are trying to figure out how to buy sanitizer, he's trying to make a dime, right? And so that was a thought process he had. That was something he was going through, something he was trying to think, like, how can I take advantage of the situation? That was reflective will. But reflective will can be good. We actually get to choose this. It could be good. Reflective will could be what's best for other people. What's best for my friend? What's best for my family or my community? What's best for people who, during this crisis, might not be able to have the same resources that I have? What's best for my relationship with God? And what's best for what God is doing in the world, even with all the craziness going on? And if those are the questions that guide our actions, then we're not acting out of impulse. We're acting out of a desire to fulfill a greater goal, even if we have to kind of quell our impulse in the process. And that's the reflective will. Now, Peter, he had both of these, right? The reflective part of him said, I have so much faith in Jesus that if he says I can walk on water, I can walk on water with him. But the impulsive will said, when the winds got strong and the fear was real, I have to pull back for my own safety. The Apostle Paul kind of talks about this too. There's this passage in Romans chapter 7. It's actually really long. I'm just going to read part of it. It goes like this: I do not understand what I do. For what I want to do, I do not do, but what I hate, I do. And he goes on for this for like several verses. It's actually really hard to follow. It's one of the hardest things to follow because of all the weird words he's using. But his point is this: Paul knows what he wants. He wants to do good. And he even uses that word later. I want to do good, but I find myself doing evil. Why is it that I want to do good and yet I do evil? And his quick answer at the top of this verse is, I don't know. Paul will unpack it a little bit later. He'll use different words than impulsive and reflective will. He'll use words like our sin nature or our flesh to talk about how sometimes we choose to do what is most convenient for us in the moment, even if it goes against God's best in our life. And that's the difference between, at least as Christians, how we approach the impulsive will and how we approach the reflective will. So we're going to jump to Matthew 26 kind of for the rest of the morning. What we're going to be looking at is how Peter goes about his final days. And what we're going to see is that Peter's patterns are pretty well ingrained. The last thing to have happened right before the verses we're going to look at is this. There's this Last Supper, and Jesus is with his disciples. He's telling them again what's about to happen, that he's going to die. He identifies Judas as a betrayer who is going to betray him, like Dave talked about last week. After this dinner, the disciples, they go outside, and they have this conversation. All this happens in one night. Things are about to get really crazy, and Jesus knows it. And so he's trying to help his disciples figure out how to best move forward with all of the crazy circumstances they're about to find themselves in. So while they're outside, Jesus tells them, "This very night you will all fall away on account of me. For it is written, I will strike the shepherd, and the sheep of the flock will be scattered. But after I have risen, I will go ahead of you into Galilee." I actually kind of love this. Jesus is just being very matter of fact. You're all going to abandon me. Things are going to get really brutal. And then I'm going to raise from the dead and join you in Galilee. All right, he's like laying out the plan. So if you've ever read the resurrection story as though it was some big surprise, it's not. Jesus has been telling them from the beginning, I'm going to die and I'm going to come back. Like, this is just how things are going to go. And the disciples can't get their minds around it. And right now, they're really stuck on this idea that they're going to fall away, desert Jesus. Because in their minds, they're with him for the long haul. They're there. And Peter especially, this is what you see in the next verse. Peter replied, "Even if all fall away on account of you, I never will." And I believe Peter meant it. This was his reflective will. This was Peter saying, I am so determined to follow you that even if everyone else here disappears, I am choosing to follow you. As we might say, according to the song, I've chosen to follow Jesus. I've decided to follow Jesus. Peter made that decision for himself. I'm going to follow you wherever you go, Jesus. This is the will that I have chosen regardless of circumstances. Peter believed in his reflective will that he could follow Jesus to the end. Unfortunately, Jesus knew that it was going to have a different ending. This is what he says in verse 34. "Truly, I tell you," Jesus answered, "this very night before the rooster crows, you will disown me 3 times. While Peter is absolutely confident in his reflective will to follow Jesus despite the circumstances, Jesus knows that when things get hard, Peter's going to revert to his impulsive will once again. He's going to abandon Jesus. What's fascinating to me is that for all the faith Peter puts into Jesus' words and teaching, he just, in this moment, does not believe Jesus. This is what he says in verse 35. "But Peter declared, 'Even if I have to die with you, I will never disown you.' And all the other disciples said the same." I am so confident in my resolve. I am so confident that I've decided to follow you, Jesus, that even if everyone else abandons you, even if I have to die with you, I will never disown you. Here's what I think Peter wasn't taking into account. Peter knows that he has an impulsive will, that he has a desire for his own safety. He's aware of that. He knows that he has a reflective will, that he's decided to follow Jesus with his life. I don't think he understands the idea of the embodied will. And this is the last one that Dallas Willard talks about. And it's not actually a different kind than impulsive or reflective. What it is the will that is most inside of you at a given moment. And so the embodied will draws from either the impulsive will or the reflective will. One of those two wins out. And the one that wins out is the one that is most deeply rooted in your heart. And we see how this comes out in crisis, kind of like the one that we've been in right now. We see some people who are acting primarily out of their impulsive will through all of this chaos. And other people, and at this church, I've seen this so often. I've seen so many people who have followed God for so many years of their lives that when it comes to this time and the things that are happening in our society, they keep saying, you know what? Jesus has this. I don't know the outcome. I don't know what's going to happen. I don't know when we're going to be able to meet together again. I don't know when the economy is going to resume. All I know is that Jesus has this. So I'm going to keep loving people. I'm going to keep serving people to the best that I possibly can, because ultimately the thing that's most important to me isn't even my own safety. The thing that's most important to me is the safety of others and how God can love others and how I could be a part of that. That becomes an embodied, reflective will that I've seen over and over again. Dave talked about some of the ways it's showing up even in our own church, and it's a beautiful thing to behold. But many times, our impulsive will and our reflective will, they butt heads. And when that happens, the one that wins out is the one that is most deeply embedded in our hearts. And that isn't something that simply happens overnight. That's something that happens as we continue to follow Jesus daily, as we step into practices that connect us with the God who loves us. Our heart actually begins to change. And the decision that we made to follow Jesus, it takes root. It becomes our primary way of operating in the world, even if circumstances get crazy. Now, what's fascinating to me at this point is that even though Jesus knows which Peter's going to do, even though Jesus knows that Peter's going to falter, he still invites him into a process by which Peter could actually form his reflective will. It's just that Peter doesn't do very well with it. The next thing that happens, verse 36, is that Jesus goes out to pray. And here's what it says, Matthew chapter 26, verse 36. That doesn't seem to be up there at the moment. So here we go. Then Jesus went with his disciples to a place called Gethsemane, and he said to them, "Sit here while I'll go over there and pray." He took Peter and the two sons of Zebedee along with him, and he began to be sorrowful and troubled. The thing that Jesus needed to do now more than anything else was pray. Jesus knew what was before him. He knew that he was about to face the biggest trial of his life, that he was going to have to actually submit to death. Jesus is well aware of this, and he knows, even as the God-man, Jesus knows that the thing he needs to be doing now is to be in prayer with God the Father, so that his reflective will, the thing that is most important, can overcome his impulsive will to preserve himself. And so he goes to pray. And he invites Peter and the sons of Zebedee along with him to do the same thing, so that they too could begin to focus on what is most important, cement their reflective will in their heart, and allow it to become embodied in who they are. This is absolutely key. But the disciples that are there, Peter, they don't do it. In verse 40, you see this. Then he returned to his disciples and found them sleeping. "Couldn't you men keep watch with me for 1 hour?" he asked Peter. And then catch this next verse. "Watch and pray so that you will not fall into temptation. The spirit is willing." Your reflective will, it's strong. Your commitment to follow, it's real. It's willing, but the flesh is weak. That impulsive will, that preservation of self, that's going to take over. And for Peter and the disciples, they have this opportunity to be there in prayer, to try to cement their reflective will as the thing that they're going to actually live out as their embodied will, and they fall asleep. And they're going to do it 2 more times. Jesus is going to go out and pray, and come back and find the disciples sleeping. He's going to go out and pray and find the disciples sleeping. And this is the last thing that the disciples are going to do before Jesus is arrested. They're going to sleep. On the eve of the most significant event in human history, the disciples are sleeping. I'm sure they're tired. I'm sure it's been quite the ride since they arrived in Jerusalem. But they missed the opportunity to actually develop toward Christ-likeness, to do things the way that Jesus did, right? Jesus invited them to do things the way that he did them. Jesus prayed. He wanted his disciples to pray, and they didn't do it. And now Jesus is going to be arrested. I'm going to jump through a couple things that happen here. Jesus, he is arrested. Judas betrays him. He's handed over to a huge crowd, a mob that has these big old scary weapons, right? And then he's brought before the Sanhedrin for a trial. And this is where things get a little bit even more interesting. So Peter, the disciples, they've all scattered at this point. But Peter, he wants to know what's going to happen with Jesus. Verse 57 says, those who had arrested Jesus took him to Caiaphas, the high priest, where the teachers of the law and the elders had assembled. Now, if you were here a couple weeks ago, you know this, that these are the same teachers of the law, the same people who, when Jesus showed up in Jerusalem, they were absolutely mortified with the way that Jesus was changing everything around them. And yet the children, they were rejoicing, shouting, Hosanna, because they believed in Jesus. Well, these same teachers now have finally had the day they've been looking for. They have Jesus, and they have their trial. And Peter, in verse 58, is going to watch from a distance. Peter followed him at a distance, right up to the courtyard of the high priest. He entered and sat down with the guards to see the outcome. Fast forwarding a little bit more, this trial was never going to be fair. It was going to be slanted from the beginning. And what they ultimately decide is that Jesus is worthy of death. Now, unfortunately for the Sanhedrin and for these religious teachers, they can't actually make that call. The Roman government has to, and so in Matthew chapter 27, there's another trial. But the religious leaders have already decided that Jesus is worthy of death. And if you're one of Jesus' disciples, this puts you in a weird position. You may not have been condemned in quite the same way, but being associated with Jesus now, that wasn't going to be favorable. That was going to be dangerous. That was going to put you on the wrong side of people with power. And so the disciples found themselves in a brutal, impossible situation where the circumstances were just overwhelming. The wind had risen around them. After this trial and after the religious teachers have decided that Jesus really is supposed to be put to death, we see this final encounter in the book of Matthew concerning Peter. Now, Peter was sitting out in the courtyard, and a servant girl came to him. You also were with Jesus of Galilee, she said. Peter, he's been called out. You were with him. You know Jesus. And Peter finds himself in this weird spot again. Earlier, he said he'd be willing to die for the man he loved, for Jesus. But in this moment, his life is threatened. The wind is rising, and Peter once again feels himself sinking. And for all of his good intentions, his impulsive will is going to win out. Verse 70. But he denied it before them all. I don't know what you're talking about, he said. I'm going to read the next couple of verses because I just want you to see how fervently Peter steps into his impulsive will. Verse 71. Then he went out to the gate where another servant girl saw him and said to the people there, this fellow is with Jesus of Nazareth. He denied it again with an oath. I don't know the man. And moving on, after a little while, those standing there went up to Peter and said, surely you are one of them. Your accent gives you away. We can hear it in your voice. You're one of them. Then he began to call down curses. And he swore, I don't know the man. Peter lost it. His sense of preservation, the fear that was welling up in him, co-opted his reflective will, co-opted the commitment he had made to Jesus. Instead, the impulsive will wins. I'm going to protect myself now. It's just about me, my own safety, and what I need in this moment. And I don't care how much I have to flail my arms to get it. I'm going to stay safe. In the other Gospels, all three of them, in fact, Peter has more story. Peter finds himself in front of the empty tomb. In the Gospel of John, he's even redeemed in a really cool way when Jesus comes back and kind of restores him to his position. But in the Gospel of Matthew, Peter is only mentioned by name in the next verse, and this is it. Immediately a rooster crowed. Then Peter remembered the word Jesus had spoken. Before the rooster crows, you will disown me 3 times. And he went outside and wept bitterly. In the Gospel of Matthew, this is the last time you hear Peter's name. It doesn't come up again. Now, the disciples as a whole are involved in things at the end, but Peter by name, this is where we leave him. He knows what he did. He knows he took the candy off the floor and ate it. And he doesn't even really fully understand everything that went on inside of him to get him to this point. If you asked him, Peter, why did you deny Jesus? I have to imagine his answer would have been something like, I don't know. I thought I had been so committed. And then the circumstance came up. The winds were big, and I just couldn't follow through. This is why Peter is his own worst enemy. He's a man of incredible faith, a man with a significant amount of flaws. And my contention is that you and I pretty much operate the same way. I mean, I know it. I know of lots of things in my life where I don't do the thing that I want to do, right? I'm a horrific procrastinator, for instance. I remember one semester in college where I had 3 giant papers due on a Thursday, and I hadn't started any of them. And so starting on a Monday, I spent 3 straight days in the library, 8 a.m. to 8 p.m., writing these papers because I had procrastinated so much, right? I get distracted easily. These things happen to me. I supposedly have the input strength, according to the Strengths Finder, which basically means I get lost in an infinite trail of news articles and forget what I was doing. It drives my wife insane. I love you. As we seek to change our impulsive will, we have to be willing to confront the areas where we are weak, the areas where we are imperfect, particularly when it comes to matters of faith. When our reflective will has decided to follow Jesus, we have to be aware of where we're likely to see that go awry. The things in our life that are going to be the great winds that are going to knock us off course. Peter had to learn a lot of those things that day. You know, in church history, what we understand is that Peter did redeem himself. He would later actually be crucified. According to church history, he'd be crucified upside down because he didn't want to be crucified in the same way that Jesus was. He was going to stand firm at the end. His reflective will was going to become his embodied will, his way of responding to people after the fact. But he had to go through a process. He had to begin to identify the things in his life that was keeping him back. He had to follow the plan that Jesus set before him. I imagine that after that day, Peter spent a lot more time in prayer than he did in the Garden of Gethsemane. He began following all of the things that Jesus said. This is how you become formed in Christ-likeness. For us today, I think that there's at least 2 things that I want us to take away. One is this: in our world today, generally speaking, people most often act out of their impulsive will, which is just kind of doing the thing that's convenient for them in the moment. And particularly in our crisis, we see this around our societies. We see people primarily acting out of fear. It happens all the time. My encouragement for us is that as Christians, we would be people who act out of our reflective will. And we do see people who have this, Christian or not. People who know that their ultimate call is to something greater than their own sense of self-preservation, their own fears, and they respond in kind. And this church has done some amazing things in that way. When we have faith in God, we can continually go back to the promises that God has made us. We can continually come before Him and say, God, form my heart so that my reflective will is the thing that I actually act out of, the desires of my heart. And the second takeaway is this. This is a really good time. I know this is not true for everybody. Some of you find yourself with a lot more time on your hands now. And if that's your situation, this might be a really good time to begin to say, okay, what are the ways in which Jesus connected with God? Because Jesus was laying the example, right? When Jesus pulled Peter into the garden and said, I'm going to pray, why don't you pray? He was showing Peter how to have a relationship with God. This might be a good time to take some of those practices and implement them in our lives. Bible reading is one of them. Going to Scripture daily, and again, with the Bible reading plan, we will help you to do that. This is a great way for us to connect with the Word of God in our lives. Some of you might find yourself in a time of imposed silence. That's not necessarily bad. Sometimes in our world, there's so much noise going on, we don't have space to reflect on the ways in which we could actually love God and love others better. In this silence, possibly even in some solitude, can we take some time to say, God, here's my heart. Here's what I want to be. I want to be someone who follows you. Mold me. As we step into those practices, I really do believe that God is going to do something amazing in our lives. I'm going to invite the praise band to come back up. Peter's story, while in Matthew, ends very sad. It's reflective of the way that we live our lives as people, of the fact that many of us, we want to do the right thing, and yet time and time again, we find ourselves doing the wrong thing, the thing we don't want to do, and we don't have a good reason for it. But today I believe that we can do what Peter did. We can decide to follow Jesus. We can say we want our reflective will, the thing that primarily guides how we live our life. We want that to be God-honoring. We want to follow Jesus with all of our actions and conversations and steps. We want that to become embodied so that whenever things get crazy and crises arise, our gut response, the first thing is to say, but God has this. And the kingdom of God cannot be stopped. Today, can we decide to follow Jesus? God, I pray as we spend some time today in our homes, as many of us spend some time this week with things just being different than they are, that you would use the disruption to change our patterns, that you would draw us into greater relationship with you, that God, we begin to practice the things that connect us to your heart. And God, as we live in a culture in which there's a lot of fear and uncertainty surrounding us, I pray, God, that you help us to move forward with confidence. Confidence, God, that you have seen this. You know everything that is happening. Confidence that you are using your church to be a blessing to our community. God, for us as people at Rose Drive Friends Church, help us to be that blessing to everyone that we encounter. Mold our hearts. Move us towards you. Change our very will. In your name we pray.